It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Labour peer and former Home Secretary David Blunkett, Conservative peer and former Culture Secretary Nicky Morgan, author and broadcaster Timandra Harkness and New Statesman Senior Associate Editor Rachel Cunliffe. Today, as we come on air, the Metropolitan Police announce they've finished their investigation into lockdown parties in Downing Street. Police say 126 fines will be handed out, but the Prime Minister will not receive any more. We'll bring you the details. The Chancellor says this.
The next few months will be tough. But where we can act, we will.
But when will he act to help households facing rising costs? And will those rising costs lead to a rise in crime?
Poverty doesn't cause crime. Actually, crime and violence cause poverty.
The radical left. Will you shut up, man? Listen, who is on your list?
And could British politics become as divided as this? Let's start today's programme with that breaking news from the Metropolitan Police about their investigation into lockdown parties at Downing Street and at Whitehall. This is what they sent out in the last half an hour or so. Met's investigation into alleged breaches of COVID regulations, Operation Hillman, concludes. Now, we already know that Boris Johnson and the Chancellor Rishi Sunak both received a fixed penalty notice for that birthday party event in number 10 Downing Street. But we also know that the Prime Minister will not receive any further fines for the events that were under investigation by the Metropolitan Police. We're joined by the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason. What else are the police saying?
So a statement from them in the last couple of hours, which we've sought a little bit of clarification on over some of the numbers and some confusion there. In total, 126 fixed penalty notices were issued by the Met as a result of this investigation. 98 people were fined. So some people were fined more than once. 12 detectives working on the case. 345 documents they ploughed through, emails and door logs and diary entries, 510 photos, 204 questionnaires, and then clarification, confirmation in the last half hour, as you say, that the Prime Minister has been told he'll face no further action, as has, we understand, his wife, and my understanding is that the Chancellor has not received any further notification either. The thing that we're still waiting for is that in the statement, Jo, the Met acknowledged that even though their work is done, there are some sort of equivalents of check in post. There are still some people who will have a fine that hasn't yet landed on their doormat.
Because there is a bit of a time lag between the two.
So 24, 48 hours before we're absolutely certain that all of those fines have landed on the right doormat.
But we know Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak and Carrie Johnson aren't going to receive any more. The Sue Gray report, the infamous Sue Gray report, of course, we had some initial findings. She is the senior civil servant that was also tasked with looking at all of these events, but held back publishing the full report until the Metropolitan Police had completed their investigation. When can we expect it?
I think it's quite possible we could get it next week, because there is a recess, Whitsun recess the week after. I think there'd be an expectation that it perhaps appears when Parliament is sitting and Parliament can react to it. Someone suggested to me it would be within the next couple of weeks. Given the recess week follows the week after next, I wonder if they might try and get it out next week, because, as you say, we've been waiting for that because of the ongoing work of the Met. Now that is complete, presumably relatively quickly, they can press go on it.
Nicky Morgan, what's your reaction? Are you surprised that Boris Johnson hasn't received any further fines?
No, but I mean, as we just don't really know sort of the details of how these cases were investigated and on what basis the police obviously have made their decisions. I think my reaction, probably shared by lots of people across Westminster, will be just, pleased that it's been concluded. I think everybody wants to get to the end of this process. As you say, we're waiting for the Sue Gray report, waiting for Durham Police to conclude their investigation into Keir Starmer and Beergate. And then I think we'll have to just sort of see what the lie of the land is.
Right. Do you think Boris Johnson is still in danger in terms of his leadership?
No, I don't pick that mood up. I mean, it's always a danger to try and second guess my fellow former colleagues, but I don't pick that mood up very much. I think with the war in Ukraine and I think other calls that the party feel that Boris Johnson has absolutely got right, I think people want to look forward. And we're going to come on to discuss the issues around cost of living. I mean, there are some really big issues that I think people want their politicians to be tackling.
Right. Do you share that view, Nikki, that Boris Johnson should be allowed to get on with his job? Or do you share the view of a considerable number of your Conservative colleagues that actually trust in the Prime Minister and his integrity has been shot to pieces?
I think the Prime Minister should be allowed to get on with the job. I think he's played a very important role in the supporting the fight in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government in their efforts against Russia. I also think there's some other big issues, particularly relating to the economy, but also the announcement of the bills in the Queen's speech last week that he should be allowed to get on with government ministers.
Do you reserve any judgment at all, bearing in mind we haven't had the full report by Sue Gray, who even in her initial findings said there had been considerable failures of leadership at Number 10. Do you think you should wait until she reports before you're so clear that he should be allowed to get on with his job?
Well, I think we have to wait. As I say, it's not just Sue Gray waiting for Durham Police to conclude their investigation into.
Well, that's into Keir Starmer, but we're talking about Boris Johnson. But you're clear. Whatever Sue Gray says, Boris Johnson should be allowed to get on with his job.
I think we should let the Prime Minister and the ministers now get on with tackling the issues that the country really wants action on.
David Blunkett, what's your reaction?
Well, I think there's probably fatigue out there on this issue, to be honest. It's not that it's gone away, because obviously there are real implications of Sue Gray's report and, of course, the Commons inquiry, which will also be going on. So there's a couple of hurdles for Boris Johnson. I never thought that Tory MPs would have the courage to push him out, partly because they don't agree on an alternative. And from the country's point of view, that's very bad news. From the Labour Party's point of view, I think it's not, because I think, contrary to what many Tories think, I think Boris Johnson is now a loser for them. And therefore, we should await to see what Sue Gray's report says. But of course, we should get on with politics as usual. I agree with a reported remark by Lisa Nandy, Shadow Minister for Levelling Up, who said, you know, people out there do genuinely want us, and that's the Labour Party, to be addressing their issues. And whilst this is really important, and it's been critical to the credibility of the Prime Minister, for most people out there, it's now a yawn.
What about, then, the status of Keir Starmer in terms of his position as leader of the Labour Party? Because he has put that on the line. Durham Police are investigating what we commonly know as Beergate, that beer and curry at campaign offices. And he has said if he is issued with a fixed penalty notice, he will resign. Angela Rayner, Deputy Leader, has said the same. On the basis of now we know Boris Johnson isn't going to receive any further fines, where does that leave Keir Starmer?
Well, I think in a strengthened position in terms of the Durham Police's analysis. They'll obviously have to take their own legal advice, but if Boris Johnson's not been fined for other work-related activities that involved food and drink, then it's very difficult to see how Keir Starmer could possibly receive a fixed penalty notice. But it is in the hands of the Durham Police. And all I can say in conclusion on this, if you don't mind, Jo, is the way in which the Met Police have announced this morning is a bit odd. Not just because of the confusion over how many fines versus how many people, but also the gender balance. I suspect the age balance. I suspect that some people had good legal advice and others didn't have access to it. I think there's a murky backstory to what has happened. I'm sorry if that is the case, because some people have been very badly hurt by it, whilst others are walking away.
Rachel, your response?
I think we should zone out from Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer and look at the culture. And the reality is that more than 100 people at the seat of government, where the rules were being made, broke them. Now, that suggests to me that they didn't necessarily understand the rules that they were making. We know that the police didn't understand the rules. There was a report from the policing watchdog out last year that showed that police were actually very confused about the rules, and understandably so, when they were changing, I think, in the first year of the pandemic on a rate of about once a week. The public were certainly confused about them, and I think there should be a learning opportunity, essentially. Now, what I'd really like to see, and it won't happen, but what I would like to see is both Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson apologise, explain that they broke the rules inadvertently, if indeed Keir Starmer did. Boris Johnson, we know, did, because he's received a fine already. So firstly, apologise. Secondly, consider a fine amnesty for all the ordinary people who were fined for breaking rules, including some students who were fined £10,000 for parties that had fewer people than the parties that were going on at Downing Street. And thirdly, a commitment to thinking very carefully about how this legislation is made in future, so we don't end up in this kind of situation again.
Interesting. I'll get to Tamandra's reaction, come back to you, Chris. Tamandra?
Yes, I agree with most of what Rachel said. I think we should definitely have a fine amnesty for all the ordinary people doing perfectly normal things who were clobbered for sometimes very large fines and criminal records under rules which the people in government were not keeping. And I would say, well, it would be ludicrous to find somebody for having a beer and a curry with your workmates when you've been working with them all day. It would be equally ludicrous to find people for suddenly having a birthday cake at a meeting when you were having the meeting anyway. But most of the rules that were imposed on the rest of us were ludicrous. They did nothing to stop the rate of infection. They did nothing to protect the most vulnerable people. And yet the rest of us were fined, and the police were coming around stopping people doing things. And that's where I think they should really be held to account. Like, the rules that they imposed were ludicrous and ineffective and stupid.
Well, reserving judgment was a common phrase, Chris, from Conservative MPs sat in this studio, and they were reserving judgment on Boris Johnson's leadership until this report, the Sue Gray report, was finally published. So we could know the decisions of a number of Conservative MPs as soon as next week. We also know that some have put in letters to cause or trigger a leadership contest, letters of no confidence in the Prime Minister. So how does this all play out, do we think, for Boris Johnson?
So we've had, 5.5 months of all of this, because this first broke on the first day of Advent, the 1st of December last year. And in the early weeks of this year, you'll remember, Jo, that the Prime Minister's future was in real jeopardy as a result of all of this. Conservative MPs boiling with anger as there was this drip of revelation. But then that really dialed back after that, particularly with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. I don't detect at the moment any sense of it bubbling back again. I think there is a certain element of lethargy around it all, and Conservative MPs wanting to put it behind them. Of course, we wait to see what's in the Sue Gray report, which is interesting. And just picking up on the conversation of the last couple of minutes, very interesting seeing the Met now kind of showing their workings around how they've gone about doing what they've done.
Oh, give us
Conscious
a flavour
that it's
of
very
that.
much in the public eye. Cost them £500,000. They acknowledged that they weren't in the business of doing sort of archaeology, if you like, around other alleged rule breaking during COVID, but obviously in this instance there was deemed to be a public interest in so doing. And the acting Deputy Commissioner Helen Ball saying included in the review of the circumstances was whether this was someone's home or wasn't someone's home. There's clearly something of an explanation around the Prime Minister. I know that many of the public were very concerned to hear reports of what had happened. We investigated that painstakingly and thoroughly and impartially. And they also make the point, of course, that during this period of the various shindigs that were looked into, the rules changed. So not every party was subject to the same rules.
And picking up Amanda's point, this issue of whether it's your home or your workplace, people were told not to have other people in their home. I mean, some of the rules were bizarre, Amanda. I happen not to be a libertarian, but I agree with you. They were totally bizarre. Most people out there were confused. The Prime Minister shouldn't have been.
Right, well, as you say, some people will have had legal representation, and they'll have been able to make something of the idea of events happening in a person's home or a place of work. We're going to bring you more of this throughout the programme, if we get it. Chris Mason, thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about cost of living and about the Chancellor Rishi Sunak and what he may or may not be doing over the coming weeks and months. He gave an annual speech to the Confederation of British Industry last night. Let's just take a listen.
There is no measure that any government could take, no law we could pass that can make these global forces disappear overnight. The next few months will be tough. But where we can act, we will.
So, when he can act, he will. That was the Chancellor last night. He's still ready to do something, Nikki. Is it an admission of his powerlessness, though, that he hasn't done so thus far to counter rising prices?
Well, I don't think we should forget that actually back in, I think it was February, there was a £20 billion package, including council tax discounts and support for people. But I mean, the reality is, and I think the Governor of the Bank of England, ended up on the front page this week because he also said there is a limited amount that governments or central banks can do at the moment in terms of tackling rising inflation. You can argue about whether they should have spotted it earlier. Interest rate rises only go so far, and of course they add to the cost of living. And with a rather strange situation, we've got a very tight labour market at the moment, going into this issue, and global energy supply problems and price rises and everything else. So I think there is a limit. I've no doubt that Rishi Sunak will want to do as much as he can, and they're looking at ways, how do they get money straight into the hands of those most vulnerable and those most struggling? And I suspect that we will hear, there'll be a few announcements, I would have thought, over the next couple of months. I don't think they'll wait until the autumn budget because it's too far off. People obviously are having real difficulties now. I think the recent energy bills people have received are a huge shock to people. Things like Kwasi Kwarteng's tackling the energy companies in terms of the amount, for example, they're taking in direct debits. Are they taking too much? Are they trying to sort of bolster their reserves at the expense of other people's household bills, for example? Those are things that make a big difference.
Right. It is interesting, though, Rachel, because Nikki refers to this, I think it's 22 billion in total, this sort of government package that they announced a little while ago, cut in fuel duty, £150 rebate for some households on their council tax, £200 loan on energy bills. Do you think they've got any credit for it?
No, I don't think they have. And I think the fact is that they spent this money in a very poorly targeted way. You mentioned fuel duty there. Well, that was 5p off fuel duty. Firstly, that only benefits motorists. And secondly, it hasn't been passed on to consumers at the petrol pump. There's also that £150 rebate on council tax, which went to many households that didn't need it. I received it. I am clearly not the person who needs that money the most. And Nikki mentioned whether that help was targeted. And the fact is that the biggest single thing that the government could do to make sure help reaches the families that really, really need it, the ones who are currently making decisions on whether to turn on their lights or skip meals or feed their kids, the way to target the help at those people is an uplift in universal credit, which we saw during the pandemic, which the Treasury has been incredibly resistant to, and that is the single thing that would help those people the most.
I mean, Tamandra, one of the things that has struck me over the last few days particularly is Rishi Sunak hesitating. I don't know why or what he's thinking about per se, but many people will be looking at the Chancellor and think, gosh, you acted so decisively during the COVID pandemic. It's not the same as a cost of living crisis, but some people think it is as much an emergency for people's household bills. Why is he not acting so decisively in terms of his reaction?
Well, without being able to mind read him, I would guess that he's torn between thinking we need to get the economy growing again, because the economy was brought shuddering to a halt during COVID. I mean, that's one of the things the lockdowns did, was to stop the entire economy. Then you've got added to that very long-term trend of generally stagnation, low productivity. Then you've got the sudden rise in fuel costs, but also we haven't really had an effective energy policy in this country, which means that energy prices have gone up because nobody has apparently sat down in the last 10, 20 years and said, we're going to actually need quite a lot of affordable energy in order for all these things to happen. How are we going to make sure that we have this reliable supply of affordable energy? And instead, there's been this monocular obsession with net zero. So it's almost like more expensive energy is seen as a plus because it will force us to use less. And then we've had the lockdowns which stop the economy and really no solution to productivity. So to return to your actual question, I think that he's torn between going, well, we really, really need to get the economy growing because that's the only way that we're going to both like refill the government coffers and give people a rising standard of living, but we also need to help people in the short term. And what have I got that I can do that will help one and not impede the other?
Well, I mean, David, on that, do you agree that the levers at Rishi Sunak's disposal, well, there just aren't very many of them because these are global pressures? Do you accept this external shock argument?
Well, there are two separate things there. I do accept that it's an external shock and external factors, which I think is why Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, was right in this respect, that putting interest rates up, using monetary policy from the bank, is not only futile, but it's dangerous. And I've heard lots of people with pseudo grasp of economic literacy actually talking about they should have done it earlier. Interest rates would be deeply damaging. Growth stalled in February. There was no growth. It actually dropped in March. We're in danger of what they call stagflation, where we have high inflation, we have the economy stalling, people are being punished already. They don't need to be punished more by making it more difficult for them to afford their mortgage or spend, or for companies to be able to raise money. So put that on one side. Therefore, it is down to the Chancellor, and the President of the CBI said so this morning. He should act now. Now, I think the reason he's delaying, and that may be very cynical of me, is that he will act, but he'll act in a way that will have a major impact on inflation in August and September. Remember, in September, that is the trigger for pensions and for welfare benefits. And I think he'd have to be out of his tinny not to do something in advance of that, rather than having to increase welfare benefits anyway in order to compensate.
Do you agree, Nikki?
Well, I think there will be an announcement before the summer. I mean, I have quite a lot of sympathy with Rachel's comment about universal credit. I think it is a different situation, obviously, from when COVID, I mean, literally everything almost stopped overnight. And so there weren't other options for people. But I think in terms of targeting the most vulnerable people for whom it would make a difference, universal credit is a Conservative introduced benefit. And the idea is to support people in terms of balancing work and if they're not receive enough money in that, then they obviously receive universal credit. And it would be a way of getting money to the most vulnerable.
All right, let's listen to the Metropolitan Police, because they've just given a statement. This is obviously in relation to the Partygate investigation being completed. Let's hear.
We knew that we were going to apply 3 criteria to decide whether we should investigate. Those criteria being that people involved knew or ought to have known that what they were doing was a breach, that not investigating would undermine the legitimacy of the law, and that there was a probable absence of a reasonable defence. As we reach today and we conclude that investigation, I think it's clear to me that starting the investigation was right, those criteria were met, and we've referred for 126 fixed penalty notices to be issued.
Metropolitan Police there establishing the grounds for their investigation and the fact that it's been completed. Let me show you this headline in The Guardian today. Police chief warns of surge in crime as cost of living crisis fuels poverty. This is an interview with the new Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Andy Cook, saying that the cost of living crisis will trigger an increase in crime. This was countered by the Policing Minister, Kit Malthouse. He was interviewed on LBC. Let's have a listen.
I have a lot of respect for Andy Cook. He's a fellow Scouser. We get on very well, but I'm afraid I find it a bit old-fashioned thinking. We first of all believe that the law should be blind, and police officers should operate without fear or favour in the prosecution of the law. But secondly, also, that it's not quite right to say that as the economy fluctuates, so does crime. Poverty doesn't cause crime. Actually, crime and violence cause poverty.
That was Kit Malthouse. Nikki Morgan, is the new Chief Inspector, Andy Cook, right to say what he said about the cost of living crisis causing crime?
No, I don't think. I mean, I think Kit was right and he is right to say as the minister that actually crime and violence cause poverty. We all know, and there's been some magnificent work done by many different bodies over the years as to the reasons that people find themselves in poverty and the things that help people to move out of poverty. I think it's too simplistic to say, look, this morning I've been chairing a digital fraud inquiry, which is conducted in the House of Lords. Fraud actually is the largest source of people's experience of crime at the moment, and that has, I would argue, not very much to do with the current economic situation. So there's lots and lots of drivers of increases in crime.
OK, so you're disputing what Andy Cook is saying. David Blunkett, how do you see it?
Well, two things. Firstly, lack of money causes poverty, and you only can get into the issue of crime causing poverty when you get into drugs and why people are stealing from other people. I never believed that crime itself was caused by poverty, that poorer people committed more crime. In fact, in the present day, as Nikki has just enunciated, in terms of fraud, that isn't the case. But there's no question that some crimes, like shoplifting, are likely to go up. And I think he was probably referring to that. So, as a generality, poor people aren't more likely to commit crime than wealthier people. Poverty doesn't lead to greater crime per se, but some crimes are undoubtedly going to be affected.
Do you think there is a link, Tamandra, between poverty and crime?
Well, I think if you look at it and say, if you have fewer opportunities for other things, then the appeal of crime as an option is going to go up. So I would say certainly if you have unemployment and so on and a complete lack of ways out, then yes. But I feel it's really insulting to people on low incomes to say, well, I expect you're going to turn to crime now, because most people, I mean, David says most people who are on low incomes do not turn to crime. The thing is, can people earn enough in work to pay their way and have a decent standard of living? We shouldn't be saying, well, it's going to be bad, so maybe we should turn a blind eye to shoplifting. We should be saying, why haven't these people got enough money in their pocket after a week's work to be able to buy what they want?
Well, I mean, I can show you the statement here. I'll read it out to you from Andy Cook. The impact of poverty and the impact of lack of opportunity for people does lead to an increase in crime. There's no two ways about it, Rachel.
Well, firstly, I believe Andrew Cook, who has direct experience in that, more than I would trust the word of Kit Malthouse. Secondly, no one's saying that if you're poor, you're more likely to have a criminal mindset. What they're saying is poverty leads to desperation, and people are in a very desperate situation at the moment. What Andrew Cook was saying is that he expects officers to display discretion when it comes to which crimes they prosecute. It seems very obvious that if you have a desperate parent who is stealing, I don't know, a loaf of bread and some nappies from a supermarket, then putting her in prison is not necessarily the best way forward. And the idea that we have the resources in this country to prosecute crimes like that, to put them through the criminal justice system and the prison system, but we don't have the resources to actually help them and prevent them from getting into that situation in the first place, and to help deal with the very urgent impact of the cost of living, is frankly ludicrous. And also, I think we covered all of this in the musical Les Miserables. It's fairly obvious that we're desperate people who cannot afford to feed their families do desperate things.
But diverting her for help is better than leaving her to do it again.
You mean somebody who's...
Not criminalising the example you've given, but actually diverting immediately for help. Because otherwise, you know, the old Polish proverb about teaching a woman or a man to fish, you've got to try and break that cycle. Otherwise, she will get herself, or himself, in a real mess, because they'll carry on doing it.
Right. What do you think, though, of the idea of giving the police more discretion when it comes to what we might call petty crimes like shoplifting?
They do. They do already.
More discretion.
They exercise discretion all the time, including, by the way, on when people are carrying a small amount of cannabis or something like that. They're always using discretion. They have to, because they're overloaded massively, which is why the detection rates are so poor.
Tamandra?
Well, they'll have a bit more time now they've finished investigating Downing Street. Obviously,
that's one thing, yeah.
But yes, I think it's right, but I do also assume that a good police force will exercise discretion and not prosecute someone who's saying, look, I'm really sorry, I'm nicking this because I've just run out of money and I've got kids to feed, and would instead prosecute someone who is, you know, enacting a large crime, fraud or whatever. I don't know if they always do, but I just think making the public statement is a bit, well, what are you saying? Are you saying, oh, well, you can't expect poor people to abide by the law when they're really poor? I just think, you know, there is some truth in it, but I just think it's a bit insulting to people on low incomes. actually.
What he actually said was that the discretion should come in terms of prosecuting, which is exactly what David was saying, making sure that you don't ignore the fact that a crime has been committed. You look at why it's been committed and whether the best course of action is prosecution in prison or whether it's some kind of other programme to help people. And at the moment, sadly, it looks like those alternative programmes just don't exist.
Should justice be blind, though, Nikki, in the way that Kit Malthouse, the policing minister, says? Or is it reasonable for police officers to use their discretion in these cases and perhaps even further?
I think it's perfectly reasonable for the police to use their discretion. And my experience as an MP, that's exactly what the police would do. And of course, even if the police decide that they want to take something further, then you have the Crown Prosecution Service who have to take a judgment about whether they're going to bring a case to court. And I'd have thought, at that stage, they would be thinking, well, hang on a second, there are extenuating circumstances and, not going to get a conviction and there are better places for the person to be helped and supported. I think what Kit was saying, and actually it supports the first story about Partygate, is that the police should police without fear or favour. They should look into everything. And don't forget, of course, shoplifting. Absolutely, there may be reasons we've just been talking about why. But for the retailer, particularly for people who perhaps small business trying to make their own living and trying to support their own family, this is also going to cost them as well. So, it's I think it's exactly what the police do. They look at all the circumstances and try to see what's going on. If someone's a repeat offender, then of course they would take further action.
All right, we're going to get more reaction, this time from the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, to the news that the Met Police has completed its investigation into parties at Downing Street.
What the investigation has shown is industrial-scale law-breaking in Downing Street, 120 or so fines, and that reflects a culture, and the Prime Minister sets the culture. What I want to see now is the full Sue Gray report published. There's no further hiding places for the Prime Minister on that.
Well, that may come as soon, of course, as next week. We're going to talk about the online safety bill. Nikki, you were responsible for launching it and setting it in motion. It's making its way through Parliament. It's designed, to use the words of the government, to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online. Will it deliver that?
Yes, I think it will. I think it's the start of a process of regulating online platforms and search engines. It is a real, and as I think I said in this programme before, a real world-leading piece of legislation. That doesn't mean that obviously it's going to solve everything that we don't like, we have a problem with about the internet, and nor should it. But other countries are watching to see how do you put a framework in place, how do you have a regulator, in this case Ofcom, making sure that the tech platforms are sticking to the terms and conditions that they say they are, and that if there are issues, if there is, again, systemic abuse, platforms turning a blind eye, not being able to have proper complaint systems, that actually somebody does step in. I think it's going to be a fascinating debate in Parliament. I think there are going to be a lot of amendments put forward, quite rightly. But this is a piece of legislation that really will, I think, make a difference. And it's very important we get it on the statute book as soon as we can.
Timandra?
I think it's a very problematic bill. I think I can completely see why you want to say, well, the internet should be a place where people can interact, it's a social space, we can all share ideas, but it can be civil and civilised, and that's not what we've got. So I completely understand the motivation, but I think it's very ill thought through. There are really loose definitions, like you've got legal but harmful content. I mean, most of the things in my life are legal but harmful, to be honest. It's like that is just
Speak for yourself,
interacting with other human beings. That's the world we live in, which is very far from perfect. I don't envy the person who has the job of deciding something is legal but harmful, and then what do you do about it? I mean, if you start making laws against things that you have said are legal, where on earth do you draw the line?
Right.
You're asking the tech companies that we are saying are the root of the problem to police themselves, but then you're asking Ofcom to oversee it in a very loose way. And the tech companies are risking fines for not acting, so they're obviously going to err on the side of caution and suppressing and banning things. So how you can keep the internet as a public space for free speech and also have internet companies regulating themselves under the eye of what Ofcom, under the threat of huge fines, I simply don't see how the existing bill can work at all.
Right, well, Nikki, respond particularly on this idea of protecting people from legal but harmful content. Who decides what that is, what's legal but harmful?
Well, there is a definition of harm in the bill, and that's it's not a new definition. It's been used in other types of bills in the past. And actually, I did a quick search where I came on, and lots and lots of obviously cases. So I mean, it is something that the lawyers are going to be arguing about. But I think what it's this is really very much at the moment, to answer to Andrew. The tech companies themselves are deciding on content. They're taking things down. Some of them have got better appeals mechanisms than others. But no, we have outsourced, what people are saying and how harmful content should be handled to Silicon Valley and to the platforms and search engines, rather than saying, actually, in the same way that we would have if you are an environmental polluter, for example, or if you are committing, as I say, fraudulent offences. So, an example of legal harmful. Yesterday, I helped to launch with Maria Miller and Alex Davis-Jones from the Labour Party the End Violence Against Women and Girls suggested code of practice for Ofcom. We know women are 27 times more likely to be harassed online than men. So it may well be content that it could be legal, but it is deeply, deeply harmful. If what that's doing is driving women out of a public space on the internet, then absolutely I want there to be some framework around that.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop the discussion. I know we could talk about it. I can feel Rachel desperate to come in. But I'm afraid because of the breaking news that we've had about that Metropolitan Police investigation, we're going to have to move on because I'm going to welcome our final guest, Frank Luntz here, close observer of politics both here and in the US, political strategist, US pollster. I could go on, but I won't. Welcome. You've given a speech this week in London, and as part of your speech, you are worried, fearful that the UK is following the same downward trajectory, you say, as the US. Explain.
We are so divided. We can't talk to each other. We can't do focus groups with each other. Republicans and Democrats cannot be in the same room with each other without tearing each other apart. And we see it in politics, the most negative campaign off your election that we've ever had in American history. And I'm nervous that the same kind of divisions are going to happen here in the UK. You are much more civil, you're more decent in the work that we've done for the Center for Policy Studies. We have seen a willingness of the left and the right to work together, a willingness to come together. And by the way, any chance I have to appear with Mr. Blunkett, this is a privilege. This is when I found out you were on the show, I absolutely had to be on. We may not agree on anything, but you are a great public servant for this country.
It's very kind of you.
And we don't have that anymore. We don't have this reaching across the aisle.
But why are you so fearful it might happen here, then?
Because you are following it, because of what happens at Cambridge. I had the chance to teach at Radley College, and there wasn't a single woke professor, not any woke students. But it's happening all across the country. Cancel culture, the idea that there's something wrong with you based on your gender or your age or your race. And we have to, it is this country that started the great debates, and we have to continue that.
David, are you as fearful?
Well, thank you for the tremendous compliment. Yeah, I am fearful. I think that it relates to our earlier, or the discussion you were having on online harms, because I think the internet's made a big difference to the nature of the dialogue and the interchange. I hope that we can get off the culture wars and the identity politics, that those who respond to those who start are committing a really dangerous act. And the sooner we get back to actually being able to genuinely disagree with each other, as Nikki Morgan and I do all the time, in a way that is respectful, the more we will teach young people that they can be active citizens and they can understand other people's point of view and disagree properly. I
mean, one of the perhaps most shocking things we witnessed last year were those images of the storming of the Capitol building. Did you ever think that could happen?
No, and it's 7 blocks from where I live in Washington, D.C. And I was actually walking in that direction, and my office is texting me saying, get away from there. That what your viewers see right now, I couldn't see from my vantage point. And I even saw a woman with a sign that says, Republicans don't riot. Well, guess what? They do. And this is the ugliness that the politics have. It's now part of society, and it is grievance politics. It is victimization politics, all that language. And David is right that both sides are responsible. It's not just a problem of the right. It's not just a problem of the left. It's all of us not treating each other with respect, with dignity, and with civility.
Do you think it could go that far, Rachel?
I think you've got to draw a distinction between the divisions in politics and the divisions in society. I mean, there was a poll out this week that shows that actually the majority of British people are very proud and very pleased of the diversity in our society. There was a poll out, I think, a year ago that showed that the majority of the public don't actually know what the word woke means. It's tossed around by politicians and pundits on shows like this, but actually it doesn't really impact people's daily lives. The culture wars, they exist. I'm not going to deny that the very fierce divisions and the very fierce polarisation. But I do think that they are something that politicians, yes, on both sides, but generally those who are in power, use in order to distract the public from the very real economic problems that they're not solving. It's very easy for this government to say, look at what the silly students are doing on universities, focus on that. Don't focus on the fact that your energy bills have shot up and you can't afford food.
I think one of the big problems is that identity and ideas have become very confused, so that when we disagree with each other, and I think we're all to a greater or lesser extent guilty of this, when someone disagrees with you, you feel that your identity, that who you are, is being attacked. And I think we all need to become more grown up about saying, look, you can disagree with my ideas, you can challenge me, you can tell me why I'm wrong, maybe I can even change my mind and I'll still be me. I can still feel confident in who I am. And I think this underlies a lot of the really big problems and divisions and fragmentation that we're seeing.
And not everything should be about politics. No. You're correct. It is about quality of life. It's about standard of living. Inflation is damning for people. Food and fuel. So is the crime rate. So is challenges of immigration, of NHS waiting lists. These are all legitimate, serious problems. But when you demonize people and dehumanize them in that conversation, it is impossible to solve it.
Rachel? And even in a liberal California, and I was there a month ago, you'll understand this very well. I was horrified to have described to me what's in the backs of cars about the comments on politicians, including the president, and what I got in taxis and Ubers. Even in California, that anger, that bitterness, that grievance is coming through. I was really taken aback by it.
Right. I mean, Nikki, do you think there is a sense, though, of what Rachel indicated, that sometimes politicians are weaponising these issues, that they are being used, that actually that anger is being stoked almost because you are sort of mobilising your base in that sense? Has that happened?
I don't think it's happened completely over here, and I think actually the funny thing is on the local campaigning, people don't do that. Politicians of all sides get out on the doorsteps and talk to their voters. But I think there is a real danger that people think that nationally elections are won by, as you say, finding wedge issues and thinking about what divides us rather than unites us. I think the point that Rachel made is very important, though, that there is a difference between what's happening in politics and what's happening in society. I don't think Twitter has been great for politics and political conversations. David's completely right that he and I can agree to disagree on things in a perfectly civilised way, and I can with lots of people from different viewpoints. But I think we should remember that Twitter is not the country. And actually, when you go out into the country, people are much more respectful. Yeah, I've had my problems, but overall, people want to debate and engage. I don't see those divisions. But you have to guard against them. Of course you do.
Frank?
I think social media is a poison. I think it's toxic. My issue with Twitter, and I use it, and I'm on it, is how do you have a serious debate when you get 140 characters, or if you're lucky, 280? How do you have any kind of substantial conversation? And thank God for the BBC, by the way.
Oh, well, on that positive note, we're going to end the programme. Thank you to all our guests. Bye-bye.